Any man who has been in a relationship for a sufficient time will, at some point, encounter this moment. The disagreement starts over a trivial matter. Perhaps she disliked your response to a message, or you raised a question about a plan she arranged without consulting you. You believe, I will simply clarify what I intended. I will remain composed. We will resolve this. 5 minutes later, you are left wondering how you were cast as the antagonist in a narrative that was non-existent an hour ago. You approached with logic. She approached with emotion. You believed it was a matter of facts. She believed it was a matter of feelings. You are engaged in a game of chess while she is engaged in a game of charades. It is like attempting to measure the speed of wind with a ruler. And still, I observe intelligent, successful, and emotionally balanced men falling into this trap every single day. They hold the conviction that if they just articulate things with enough clarity, enough calmness, and the correct data or examples, it will all become coherent. It will not. Because the conflict was never about the words that were spoken. It was about how she felt as a result of what you said. I had a client who once told me, "I don't understand it, Doc." I conceded to her, and she remained upset. That line ought to be inscribed on every man's T-shirt. Agreement does not resolve emotional friction. You can declare, "You're right, I understand." And she will still feel as though she wasn't heard, because what she desired was not your concurrence. It was your emotional capitulation. She did not want you to comprehend the point. She wanted you to feel her frustration. And when you remain logical, she feels you are disconnected. When you exhibit emotion, she feels assailed. When you fall silent, she feels disregarded. You cannot prevail, because prevailing is not the goal. Emotional validation is. Let's explore what I refer to as the empathy paradox. Contemporary men are advised to listen, validate, and empathize. And that is good counsel, up to a certain point. But this is what occurs in application. A woman says, "You never make time for me anymore." The man responds, "That is not accurate. We had dinner on Tuesday. We went out on Friday." He is presenting data. She hears it as deflection. He is attempting to provide clarification. She feels invalidated. So, he attempts the empathy script. "I can understand why you feel that way." But now she is angered because it sounds mechanical, like a therapist speaking to a patient. The paradox is this: when men attempt to validate emotion by using logic, they sound sterile. But when they attempt to meet emotion with emotion, they are accused of being reactive or hostile. This is why liberated men who have done the internal work, who regulate their own emotions, who are secure in their worth, eventually cease to argue. It is not because they have surrendered, but because they comprehend the cost. Arguing with an individual who is emotionally invested in misinterpreting you depletes the energy that should be allocated to protecting your peace. It is not a weakness to disengage. It is discipline. The contemporary world celebrates outrage. Every argument is an exchange of power. The individual who loses composure first loses control of the frame. Liberated men grasp this. That is why they remain calm, even when baited. But here is the irony. Their composure is frequently misconstrued as coldness. I have watched women become even more incensed because the man declined to mirror their emotional state. They mistake composure for contempt. One of my clients said something brilliant on one occasion. He told me, "It's like being punished for not being dramatic enough." He is correct. In a culture that is addicted to emotional displays, stoicism appears suspicious. People equate calmness with indifference. But liberated men are not cold. They are self-contained. They have learned that peace is more valuable than the need to be proven correct. That is not arrogance. It is survival. Every time you engage in an argument with someone who is determined to feel offended, you lose twice. Once in the argument itself, and again in your own mind, replaying what you might have said differently. I recall a couple I worked with for months. He was articulate, considerate, and emotionally perceptive. She was expressive, passionate, and reactive. Every session adhered to the same pattern. He would explain. She would interject. He would pause. She would escalate. And every time, I would watch the vitality drain from his face as he understood that nothing he said was getting through. Once emotion took over the room, one day he looked at me and said, "I can't outfeel her." And that was the moment, the breakthrough, because he was right. He was never meant to. That is not his domain. The more he attempted to demonstrate empathy, the more he lost his own sense of self. Here is the trap. Men are conditioned to solve things. You present us with a problem, we search for a solution. But many conflicts with women are not problem-based. They are process-based. They are not seeking a resolution. They are seeking resonance. When she says, "You don't care," she is not requesting evidence. She is communicating a sense of disconnection. If you counter with evidence, you sound insulting. If you counter with silence, she feels unseen. The only maneuver that is effective is one that cannot be taught by logic. Presence. Not fixing, not debating, just being. But that is also the reason so many men withdraw entirely. Because they have learned that in emotional tempests, silence is the only flotation device that does not sink. Allow me to address something controversial. Some women utilize emotion as a tool, not out of malice, but because it is effective. Tears, tone, accusation. All of these can reset the dynamic immediately. Men, particularly empathetic ones, are hardwired to protect. When a woman cries, most men capitulate, not because they are guilty, but because they are conditioned to de-escalate at all costs. That is not a partnership. That is emotional blackmail presented as vulnerability. And the tragedy is, it often is not even conscious. It is a learned behavior that has been reinforced by the culture. The notion that emotional expression is equivalent to holding the moral high ground. But emotion is not morality. Feeling wounded does not automatically make you correct. I tell my male clients this constantly. Your peace is not evidence of your guilt. Your refusal to engage in an argument is not avoidance. It is awareness. When you identify that the discussion has departed from the realm of logic, you exit with grace. You do not shout. You do not defend. You do not justify. You simply state, "I am not having this conversation right now," and walk away. That is not disrespect. That is emotional self-defense. Because arguing in that state does not mend the relationship. It only teaches her that chaos is what secures your attention. Another client of mine, a 42-year-old entrepreneur, expressed it perfectly. He said, "I used to believe walking away made me weak. Now I realize it's the only reason I'm sane." He stopped debating feelings. He stopped clarifying jokes, explaining his tone, and apologizing for perceptions he did not intend to create. Instead, he began responding with boundaries. Not walls, boundaries. There is a distinction. Walls exclude everyone. Boundaries protect your own sanity. The modern man's liberation is not concerned with dominance. It is concerned with detachment from emotional chaos. It is the understanding that your time, your energy, and your composure are finite resources. When you argue with someone who thrives on a reaction, you are donating your emotional capital to a black hole. That is not love. That is servitude. Relationships do require communication, yes, but not every confrontation qualifies as communication. Some are pre-practice performances designed to reestablish emotional leverage. And let us not disregard the social double standards. If a woman storms out of a room, she is asserting boundaries. If a man does the same, he is dismissive or controlling. If she cries, she is sensitive. If he remains calm, he is cold. The emotional rules are not symmetrical, and pretending that they are will only lead to madness. A liberated man accepts this asymmetry without resentment. He does not squander time demanding fairness. He constructs systems, internal systems, to safeguard himself. That is what true equality looks like in application. Equal responsibility for self-control, not equal opportunity for chaos. The irony is, the more stable a man becomes, the less compatible he becomes with volatility. This is why so many calm, grounded men feel alienated in the world of modern dating. They are not emotionally unavailable. They are emotionally selective. They recognize the cost of engagement, and they refuse to spend their peace at a low price. These men do not ghost. They drift away quietly when they detect the onset of emotional warfare. They do not slam doors. They close them gently, and they never reopen them. I once asked a longtime client, a quiet, humble engineer, what changed after he ceased arguing with his wife. He said, "At first she got louder, then she got confused, then she got quiet, and finally she started to listen." That is what occurs when you withdraw the fuel from the fire. Chaos requires attention in order to survive. When you cease to feed it, it consumes itself. That is not manipulation. It is emotional neutrality. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Arguments are not always about failures in communication. Sometimes they are about control. The louder the emotion, the more desperate the attempt to reassert influence. When a liberated man refuses to argue, he is not stonewalling. He is rejecting the emotional script that dictates love equals conflict. He is stating, "I will talk when we are both calm, but not before." And that sentence frightens people who only comprehend intensity, not intimacy. The more you refuse to argue, the more clearly you begin to perceive patterns. You observe how some conflicts are not accidents. They are cycles. You observe how apologies are frequently used as resets, not as resolutions. You observe how people who profess to hate drama seem to always be the ones creating it. And you realize something liberating. Peace is not the absence of noise. It is the refusal to participate in it. I tell men in my sessions constantly, do not confuse communication with connection. Just because someone is talking does not mean they are listening. And just because someone is listening does not mean they understand. Some arguments are rehearsed emotional theater, scripts that are repeated until someone at last decides to stop performing. When you refuse to argue, you sever the pattern. You become the first quiet in a household that is accustomed to yelling. And that silence at first drives people insane. But in time, it commands respect. The modern liberated man does not avoid confrontation because he is afraid of conflict. He avoids it because he understands how energy works. Every argument is an energetic transaction. You either give or you guard. And when you continually give to conversations that lead nowhere, you bankrupt yourself emotionally. You begin to lose focus, ambition, and even your self-respect. You wake up fatigued, not from work or life, but from defending yourself in someone else's emotional courtroom. That is why I tell men, you do not owe anyone your emotional participation. Not your partner, not your ex, not the individual attempting to provoke you online. The only person you owe calmness to is yourself. The moment you grasp that, you cease trying to convince anyone of your perspective. You cease trying to win debates. You realize the only victory that matters is inner stability. And ironically, that is when you begin to see real change. Because the truth is, emotional chaos thrives on resistance. When you stop pushing back, it loses its rhythm. It cannot sustain itself. That is why you will often see someone rage even louder when you become quiet. They are trying to restart the old dynamic. They desire the reaction, because reaction equates to attention, and attention equates to power. When you stop reacting, you reclaim your power completely. I remember a man I coached last year, divorced, mid-40s, a brilliant mind, a calm demeanor. He said, "Doc, I used to think arguing showed strength. Now I see strength is in saying nothing at all." That is growth. That is liberation. Because arguing does not prove dominance. It proves investment. And you should never invest where there is no return. Let me tell you something brutally honest. Some people do not want understanding. They want submission. They want you to yield emotionally so that they can feel secure. But security that is built on control will always collapse. And when you finally withdraw from that dynamic, they will accuse you of being cold, detached, arrogant, or manipulative. Do not take the bait. That is the narrative of someone who is losing emotional influence. As a therapist, I have seen this play out 1,000 different ways. A man tries to argue his innocence. He explains every text, every schedule, every inflection of his tone. She counters with emotion, not logic, until he is apologizing for intentions he never possessed. He walks out drained, and she feels justified. Temporarily. But what neither of them sees in that moment is the long-term cost. Respect dies a little every time an argument supplants understanding. And once respect is gone, the relationship is already halfway to its end. That is why the most liberated men do not chase being understood. They chase being at peace. They understand that arguments do not resolve emotional immaturity. They expose it. The calmer you become, the more chaotic people reveal themselves to be. That is not arrogance. That is emotional X-ray vision. You start seeing people not for what they say, but for what they are seeking. You stop trying to convince, and you start observing. You start realizing not everyone merits a response just because they demanded one. I often say men do not truly become free until they stop feeling the need to prove their point. That is the moment confidence transforms into quiet power. You walk away not because you are weak, but because you have outgrown the necessity of being right in rooms where no one is listening. You stop chasing closure and you start building composure. You stop arguing for peace and you start embodying it. Some of you listening right now have spent years walking on eggshells, explaining, clarifying, apologizing for simply existing logically in emotional environments. You have been conditioned to believe that being calm is cold and that being direct is cruel. That is not true. Clarity is not cruelty. Stability is not silence. A liberated man's calmness is his rebellion against emotional chaos. It is how he protects his identity from being rewritten by someone else's feelings. And yes, the world will tell you to communicate more. But communication without emotional maturity is just noise. It is like two radios on different frequencies, trying to tune into each other by shouting louder. No matter how sound your argument is, it will not translate in a language that is built on insecurity. You cannot reason someone into self-awareness. You cannot logic someone into calmness. You can only protect your own. Liberated men understand something that changes everything. Not every disagreement deserves closure. Some deserve distance. Some deserve silence. Some deserve your absence entirely. Because peace is not discovered through endless dialogue. It is maintained through selective engagement. You do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. You do not have to prove your calmness in the midst of chaos. Sometimes the most powerful statement you will ever make is walking away mid-sentence. One of my favorite moments in a session was when a client, a 50-year-old father of 3, said, "I stopped arguing and my house got quieter, but so did my mind." That is what emotional liberation looks like. Less noise, more clarity. You do not need to be louder to be heard. You need to be grounded enough to not care if you are misunderstood. Because people who are committed to misunderstanding, you do not deserve explanations. They deserve distance. And let's be honest, when a man refuses to argue, it terrifies people who thrive on control. They will try to bait you with guilt. You don't care. You're shutting down. You're avoiding accountability. But liberated men know the difference between avoidance and awareness. Avoidance runs from pain. Awareness chooses which pain is worth feeling. And arguing with someone who is determined to feel victimized is not pain worth feeling. It is emotional self-sabotage. You want to know the ultimate power move? Respond with presence, not participation. Do not defend. Do not debate. Just observe. Let them project. Let them interpret. Let them spin their narrative, because once you stop feeding the emotional story, it collapses under its own weight. That is what emotional strength truly looks like. Being the calm center of the hurricane, not another gust of wind. And the funny thing? Once you master that, people begin to treat you differently. They approach with more caution, more respect, more mindfulness. Because chaos does not challenge men who will not fight it. It avoids them. It knows it cannot win. That is why truly liberated men are magnetic. Their energy is too expensive to be wasted on triviality. Their silence speaks louder than anyone's argument ever could. So when you find yourself tempted to argue, to prove your point, to defend your tone, to justify your intent, remember this. You are not obligated to bleed emotional energy just because someone else refuses to regulate theirs. Walking away is not losing. It is winning with dignity. It is reclaiming your time, your peace, and your masculinity. Because true liberation is not about controlling others. It is about never letting them control you. And that is the paradox of it all. The moment you stop arguing to be understood, you finally understand yourself. You realize your peace was never in her reaction. It was always in your restraint. The argument ends when you decide it is not worth continuing. The cycle ends when you stop spinning. The game ends when you put down the board. That is why liberated men never argue with women. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much about protecting the man they worked so hard to become. The one who no longer trades peace for validation. The one who no longer proves his worth through persuasion. The one who, when faced with chaos, simply smiles, stands up, and says quietly, "Not today."